Facebook.
Everybody will be famous from now on, okay?
Yeah, we use the Facebook platform and online platform like Instagram and etc. for campaign, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's for campaign. Okay, so okay.
And also, yeah, it's okay.
Go ahead, Matt.
No. No,
Okay.
some friends asking that they not able to join now and they would like to,
Okay.
Yeah.
so
Okay.
they have better access after the session as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
If anyone want to join but not willing to register and need the Zoom link, just let me know. It's
Just
free.
share the link. Okay. All right. So I think we can mute the microphone for a while. I mean, like, so we're gonna start our talk show today. All right. So thank you, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Well, I think that's the best way to greet all of you because we are from all over the world, like because we are, like from different countries with different time zone. Yeah, thank you for having me here as moderator today. And thank you also for the speakers, all of the speakers from different countries as well. And for accepting our invitation and to be part of our program, especially for celebrating the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Thank you for everyone joining the Zoom meeting for our program and special event today. And thank you for our sign language interpreters, Yulina and Mada, who helped Let's Talk to give service for deaf community, so they can join us. They can also access through Facebook, through live streaming, and also this talk show. We're recording this talk show, so like everybody can have access to the YouTube, like visit our YouTube channel later. And as our commitment that we want to become part of the production and distribution of knowledge about sex, gender, feminism, sexuality, and intersectionality, because one of the approaches that we have, it's part of our commitment and focus, is intersectionality, because we believe that gender is not the only entity. We have to talk about class. We have to talk about nationality. We have to talk about religion, ethnicity. We have to talk about sexual and gender minorities and gender diversities, because gender is not, like the only social organization in this world, right? In this society. So we need to talk about other vulnerable groups. That's why we use the approach of intersectionality. So Talkshow is a forum that we founded, like some women activists or feminist activists in Indonesia founded during the pandemic. I think this is one of the benefits, right? A blessing in disguise that we have during the pandemic, because we can meet each other, we can reconnect, we can connect and reconnect, like globally, not only locally and nationally. So I haven't met some feminist activists like in Indonesia, like Mbak Aida, Mbak Yuni, for quite a long time. And now like we reconnected. It's so happy. And I can meet Sharon and Shamila. That's my old colleagues. Like we went to the same university. And then I can meet Maria and Undaria. I never thought about that before, like the COVID-19. I think this is one of the new tradition of activism, as well as the academia, right? And there is a transformation and change in terms of the way that we can use technology, we can meet on the screen. So well, today's talk show is a series 8, and this is the first time that Let's Talk uses English, because one of the goals is to celebrate the 16 days of activism or campaign against gender-based violence, and one of the international events that connects feminists and women's rights defenders or women's human rights activists all around the globe. That's why we call it like specific or special event. We did some talk show before by inviting some speakers from outside Indonesia, from different countries, but we did not we did not use English because the speakers could speak Indonesia, and the target audience is also like Indonesian. But now, like from the registration form, we saw that there are some like audience of participants. They also come from Western Australia, from Russia, from, I don't know, they here or not yet, but that's from the registration form that we saw, from the Philippines as well, and from other countries. From India, there is an old friend. She said she's coming to this event. I think the theme that we have today is understanding differences, building solidarity, gender-based violence movement in different contexts or different countries. We we are aware that we use gender-based violence rather than violence against women, because we're trying to include all of the sexual and gender minorities, not only women, but also there are a lot of gender minorities, gender diversities, and sexual diversity and minorities. So that's why we call it gender-based violence. We celebrated the International Day of women's against women, violence against women on November 25th. But for the 16 days, we use gender-based violence. Just a little bit introduction before we introduce all of the speakers here. Well, when we talk about differences, right, this is like fancy words. This is kind of like nice words. It is easy to say, but it's really hard to implement or to apply it. So because we know we are from different countries, we're from different part of the world, and then we have our own culture, we have our own religions, we have our own ethnicities, and different causes, like root causes of gender-based violence or violence against women. We also have like different gender politics. We also have like different social organizations, you know, the policy of the states, for instance. There are a lot of things that are different from one country to another country. Even if we are in the same country, like I'm from Medan, Mbak Aida, for instance, from Kalimantan, Mbak Yuni, for instance, from other part of the Indonesia, but we are different. There is none the same experience, even though that we are women, for instance. So I remember a feminist theorist, a Black feminist activist, Bell Hook. She's one of my favorite feminist activists. She published a book about feminism is for everybody, right? I think she proposed that feminism is a social, political, and intellectual notion of anti-oppression, about anti-injustice, to emancipate, to liberate ourselves, right? And she also put forward the idea of sisterhood, right? This is an articulation of solidarity derived from women's experiences, not only as passive and permissive victims, but also as like social agent, as main actors who have agentive capacity to challenge and to transform the structural and cultural oppression or violence against women or gender-based violence. So the question that we would like to ask today is it possible to have global solidarity and global alliances among us, among women, among vulnerable groups, right, in the world? So is feminism for everybody, like Bell Hook asked in her book? So solidarity is based on our experiences, women's experiences, vulnerable groups' experiences, right? And the experiences are different. We have our own subjectivity. So the question is how the diverse ideology, strategy, and movement respond to those differences, to those like different, right? Different culture, different social and political organizations, different social, political, cultural contexts. So on one hand, right, we have to understand the differences. But on the other hand, we also have to respect, right, respect those differences. So we need to know, is there any global solidarity? And if yes, the answer is yes, how does it look like? So we invite speakers, like we have like 6 speakers from 6 different countries, but please be mindful, even though that they are from different countries, but they do not represent like their own countries. They do not represent all women in their countries, right? Like both the countries where they live in right now or the countries where they come from, because we have our own experiences, we have different subjectivity. But from them, I think we can learn how diverse and complex the issue of gender inequality and gender injustice, right? And then we can learn from them and also from the audience and the participants here about the strategies, the lesson learned, the best practices from their stories, right? From their experiences, from their knowledge. So without further ado, I would like to introduce all of the speakers here. But I'll just give you a heads up. So the format of the discussion is like what we saw in the flyer. So this is talk show, meaning that there is no PowerPoint presentation, right? There is no slides. So this is kind of like relaxed but serious. Relaxed conversation is interactive. So as a moderator, I would like to ask some questions to the speakers so that the first part and the second part, I'm gonna allow participants or audience to also share your stories and also share your opinion, or you could ask questions to each speaker. So I'll give you an opportunity for you to raise your hands, and I'll allow you to unmute yourself, unmute your microphone, and also you could put your questions or your statement in the chat. So that's the format of our discussion. All right, so let me introduce all of the speakers. First speakers, we have Undarya Tumusu. She is from Mongolia, but she has currently lived in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. She has been engaged in gender equality and social justice, human rights issue for quite long. She is a regional gender equality advisor Asia at International Rescue Committee, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. And she's also part of the Mon Femnet National Network, Mongolian Feminist Network, Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. And she becomes an advisor now. She received her PhD in public policy, Auckland University of Technology in 2018. She was a candidate political science at Rutgers State University of New Jersey, New Brunswick in 2004, 98 and 2004. And she finished her Master of Art in International Relations and European Studies at Central European University. She's also involved in the regional learning community of East and Southeast Asia to transform patriarchal masculinity. Thank you, Dr. Tumursuk, for joining us today. Next speaker, second speaker is Daniela Valle. Hi, Daniela. She's my classmate before. Daniela is from the United States of America. She was born and raised in Florida, where she also completed her undergrad degree. After finishing her undergrad studies, she moved to New York State and pursued her master's degree in anthropology at Binghamton University, State University of New York, or SUNY. She currently resides in Washington State and engages in nonprofit work involving women in domestic violence situations. In YWCA, that's like the oldest non-profit organization in the US, to eliminate racism and empower women, to enhance the lives of youth and women, and to promote peace, freedom, and justice for all. Thank you, Daniela, for joining us for this talk show. Third speaker, we have Yunianti Huzaifa, although usually called Yuni, Mbak Yuni. Hi, Mbak. It's nice to see you again. Mbak Yuni is a women human rights activist and former commissioner of National Commission on Violence Against Women. She is a PhD candidate at University of Amsterdam. She is former chairperson of the National Commission on Violence Against Women, or Komnas Perempuan, in 2010 to 2014. Thank you. And we also have Shamila Daluate, who's also my old friend at Brandeis University. Shamila is from Sri Lanka, but currently she lives in Rhode Island, USA. She is a lawyer by training. Her work experience centers on human rights, gender equality, and international development. Shamila graduated from Harvard University with a master's in public administration. She also served in the Harvard Kennedy School Student Government as the Vice President of Diversity and Inclusion. She's also a professional trainer whose trainees have included police cadet, military members, judges, students, parliamentarians, female politicians, youth groups, and ex-combatants. She has written at least 10 training manuals, 3 of which have been published. Shamila has worked in the conflict and post-conflict countries of Sri Lanka, and she also worked in Indonesia before, in Banda Aceh, and Afghanistan for UN agencies, ILO, UN Women, UNFPA, and UNDP. She is also a poet and co-author of a poetry book. Most of her poems are dedicated to gender equality issues. Thank you, Sham. Nice to see you again. Next speaker, we have Maria Rashid. She is a feminist practitioner, trainer, and researcher in the field of gender, violence against women and children. Dr. Maria Rashid has been working in the human rights and development sector for over 22 years now. A psychologist by training, she's been associated with various non-governmental groups in Pakistan, including heading a national women and child rights organization for 14 years. She acquired her PhD in politics and international studies from the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London in 2018. And her book, Dying to Serve, Militarism, Affect, and the Politics of Sacrifice in the Pakistan Army, was published in 2020. Congratulations, Maria, for your new book, published by Stanford University Press. She continues to be involved in programming, trainings, and research on violence against women, gender, and masculinities, but nationally and in South Asia. And last but not least, we have Sharon Karingal. I hope I pronounced your name correctly, right, Sharon? Okay. Sharon is a professor of history, area studies, and social sciences, Department of Social Sciences, College of Arts and Sciences, University of the Philippines, Manila. And she also is professor of management and health policy studies, graduate program, College of Arts and Sciences, University of the Philippines, Manila. Her area of specialization are gender studies, area studies, Philippine history, public management, and public policy. And her research interests are health social science, HIP MSM, gender studies, policy studies, conflict resolution. She received Bachelor of Arts in Social Sciences, Political Science, History, University of the Philippines, and she received her Master of Management of Public Management at the University of the Philippines. And she received some awards. Some of them are 1UP Professional Chair and Faculty Grant Awardee for Outstanding Teaching and Research, International Publication Awardee, UP Manila and University of the Philippines, an Outstanding Teacher, College of Arts and Sciences. Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Dr. Karingal, for joining us today. So, all right, so we're gonna start our talk show now. So, because Undaria has right? And Dr. Timurso will be leaving earlier, right? Since you have another commitment to attend a workshop, so I will start asking questions to you. Okay, and I will go back to you before you're leaving. I'll make sure that we benefit like your expertise and your activism here. So, okay, Undaria now lives in Kuala Lumpur. So Undaria, you have a lot of experiences, right, of living in different countries and worked with some different organizations in Mongolia, in the US, New Zealand, and Malaysia. So how your like experiences, how do those experiences like contribute to your perspective, your perspective, your knowledge, and how do they shape your vision and your perspective, right, as advocate of gender equality and justice? So how do you think that differences, how do you find, like, from your experiences, right, like similarities and differences among those countries, like in the US, New Zealand, Malaysia? What are the similarities and differences in terms of the gender equality or inequality issues in each country, right? And what's your position on that? If you find any like differences from the US culture, for instance, or the US root causes of gender inequality with the ones in New Zealand or Malaysia. So please, Undaria, if you could respond to those questions. Are you still muted? Okay.
Oh, am I still muted?
It's okay.
Okay, just a second. Where is it? Huh. I'm still muted?
No, you're already unmuted.
It's okay now.
Okay, yeah. Sometimes it's strange because when I have a speaker connected. Yeah, thank you for the questions and thank you for inviting me to this talk show. And I really, really wish I could have stayed, until the end and engaged in conversation fully. I was thinking in terms of these international or comparative perspectives, I would start for myself. I would start even earlier because I grew up in then socialist Mongolia, which was part of the so-called Second World. It was part of the Soviet bloc. I grew up in a very, very different system, socially, politically, economically, as well as culturally. And Soviet Union is very much part of my childhood. I grew up as basically bicultural, bilingual Mongolian, because my family was very much connected to the Soviet Union. My mom in the 60s, she worked in Moscow for years. My eldest brother grew up there. My father studied in Irkutsk in Siberia. And then when I was little and my older brother, my mom went back to work in Moscow. So we lived for 3 years when we were like little kids and teenagers. And we also went to what is called Soviet school, so Russian schools but we went to a special school which was had to like take exams, very strict exams when you were 8 years old to enter even, these schools, which meant my mom needed to teach us Russian when we were very young, and we were self-taught by mom. She self-taught herself. So language, like functioning in different languages and functioning in different cultural spaces, was very much something that I grew up in. And then, of course, in 1989, 1990, the transition from so-called communism or socialism started, right? And so now Mongolia is in the third decade of post-socialism. So I have had my generation and, the older, we have actually had the experience of working almost in 2 different countries, even if we didn't have any kind of international exposure. Mongolia before transition and Mongolia after transition is something completely different. And Mongolia in the first 10 or 15 years of transition and now, completely different. So I think in a way you don't really have to go far to compare. I can compare very well what gender equality was before 1990 and what it is now, and what it is now is becoming more and more similar to the post-colonial world, quote unquote, third world. And in some ways also what gender equality or situation of human rights, socioeconomic inequalities is what is also in US, right? And what is also in New Zealand. I guess what I mean is that what I have come to realize, particularly in the last 10 years, I've really been trying to deepen my analysis of neoliberal capitalism and post-communist democratization process that has been wrapped up with neoliberal transition to neoliberal capitalism. It was less transition to democracy, more transition to neoliberal capitalism. And that is something that I very much clearly see now. And so I see everything sort of from that perspective, how all of us, no matter where we are, whether it is New Zealand or, US, Hungary, or Canada, or, in this part of the world, we have been embroiled in this global process of capitalism, neoliberal capitalism, and the structural adjustments. So I think one of the shocking things for me when I went to New Zealand was that they were talking about structural adjustment too. And I had thought structural adjustment was something that we experienced as a post-communist country as transitioning from the socialist system to so-called democracy. But then when I went to New Zealand, I had the time, the opportunity to take time out of my activism and really read and also explore this new area for me, which I felt extremely important for any activism that we do, which is political economy, not just political culture. I think we have done so much analysis as feminists, as social activists on culture. And I think we also got stuck at that level of culture and have not really done the work of looking at the structure, political economic structures that are interwoven with the cultural processes and political processes and the social processes. So I think overall, I would say, regardless of where we are, I think there is that big gaping hole still in our mindset and in our analysis as activists that we are not yet well equipped to integrate the economic aspects, the structural aspects of power, right, into our analysis, whether it is anti-racism, whether it is feminism, whether it is, anything else that we're all LGBTIQ rights. So I think what the international sort of experience, not just international, but in terms of actually living in different countries, what that gave me is that we need to have a more refined analysis of the different policies, right? And I guess for me, it was very fortunate to spend some time in New Zealand, which is more social democracy oriented, or at least was, before the Labour Party started neoliberal transition in the 90s. And interestingly, New Zealand is like one country where Labour Party started neoliberalization programs. This was also a different kind of colonial, post-colonial setting, and it gave me a chance to compare, because I've always been interested in Native Americans, right, and the indigenous peoples, and then of course when I was at Rutgers, I was studying intersectionality theories and post-colonial feminism, I should say. Is a very strong influence on me as a feminist, but also critical race studies and the intersection of all of that, right? So for living in New Zealand for me was really interesting, because I could see how different the relationship between the indigenous peoples was in Canada, in US, in Australia, in New Zealand, depending on how the colonial patterns worked. right? And how the nation was built. And I think uh, for me, when we say intersectionality, for me, it is not so much intersectionality in terms of how different we are, right? Differences are great, you know, I revel in differences, but for me, when it comes to activism, it is about the intersectionality of the structures of oppression. And if we want to understand the structures of oppression, we need to take a historical perspective, and we need to take a very contextualized approach. So for example, at Rutgers, my major was comparative politics. So I'm just like I can't help it. My mind works in a comparative analytical manner. So I had a chance to compare and also read about structural adjustments in Canada, right? The feminist work on care economy and so on, you know, Canada, which had a very well established public system of education, of health, welfare, and similar New Zealand and Australia, and in many Western European countries also, these systems were well established after the World War II, unlike in US. So to compare that and to understand that, hey, this is actually really a global phenomenon, right? And people, even civil society, which from Mongolian perspective, we thought like NGOs in other countries are doing so well, they are well funded, la la la. So understanding that that was not true, that they're struggling with some of the issues that we are struggling, even if they are in wealthier countries, right? And also how the whole system of the state-civil society relationship and the conception and definition of civil society is different and problematic and so on. That was really eye-opening because, again, coming to the post-coloniality, one of the things that really concerns me is that in the quote-unquote global South, we still have to decolonize many ways in which we have been conditioned to think that we are somehow backwards. We don't have the modern science. We don't have the modern techniques. We don't have the modern analytical frameworks. Somehow we are behind. There's always this sense of backwardness, which we had during socialism vis-a-vis Soviet Union, and then which we in Mongolia still have vis-a-vis quote unquote the West. And the West in people's imagination is this idealized notion of US really. So I think that is something that we still have to really work against and talk to each other more across countries, but also within countries and across different lived experiences. So three things I know I'm rambling, I could say so much more, but I'm thinking as an activist for me, to go back to your question about global solidarity, whether it is possible or not, I absolutely believe it is possible because I believe in the, from my culturally Buddhist and ethically Buddhist perspective, I believe in the oneness, in diversity, in many. For me, there is no juxtaposition, dichotomy between being one together and also being, separate, and we're both. So, but I think in order for us to get there, it is extremely important to continuously deepen and improve our analysis of these structural inequalities, of the ways in which they intersect, of the ways in which they were historically constructed, and the ways in which they continue to be reproduced, even if they, changing shape and so on. Without that clear understanding of structural, when we talk about differences, we are stuck at the very superficial level, and it is extremely dangerous. Because oftentimes when we talk about solidarity, it becomes a homogenizing force. And when there is a homogenizing force, the more dominant become represented more than the others. Secondly, analysis will never be complete. It is impossible, right? Because the world is complex and also it changes all the time. And while some perspectives may percolate up like through people like us, right, who are not white, who come from different cultural backgrounds, and we go to Western universities and we learn those, you know, quote unquote, modern techniques, and we produce these analyses, we complicate. In the back of my mind, I'm still thinking, are we still using the Western hegemonic tools and Western hegemonic conceptual frameworks to describe our realities and other people's realities? So I think second point, like the first point is analysis, second point is humility. And I think that second point is extremely important. We need to remember that no matter how much we widen our perspectives and deepen our analysis, it will still be a very limited view. Of me, of my group, of this sector, even together, it's still partial truth. It's still partially distorted truth. And I think if we approach this global solidarity or activism with that understanding that what I see is always partial and not always true, then we have a better possibility of really connecting and of really listening and of really learning. And thirdly, I think having experiences to connect, and I mean experiences, not just like intellectual project reading each other's papers or having intellectual discussions, but experientially connect, right? Come together in one space, now virtual, but you know, physical as well, opportunities to work together, right? And I think that is only how we can work towards global solidarity, while global solidarity will always be an ideal, right? In a way, utopia, but utopia that guides us towards where we want to go. Over.
Thank you, Dr. Tumursuk, for your insightful, for your fruitful explanation and your sharing. I think there are a lot of things that we can grasp from your explanation, right? Like, yes, it is possible to build, you know, and maintain global solidarity and alliance of gender equality movement across countries, across the globe. And we need to understand the differences. We need to understand like the cultural process, political process, like you said, cultural context, social, political, and structural analysis, cultural analysis. And we need to also use intersectionality approach or analysis, like you said. I think the structure of oppression, for instance, feudalism, capitalism, like you said before, this is very important, especially for the global South or the third world countries, right? We have like a lot of, you know, like experiences in terms of the feudalism. That's why like post-colonial critique, it also like is very important. It comes from Pakistan, from India, from South Asia or Southeast Asia, right? And so yeah, but we also need to understand like, you know, in what aspect that we need to be global and what aspect at what level we need to be aware of locality or particularity in building such a global solidarity. So I would like to continue to ask you questions before you leave later. So about the, this is the questions about Mongolia, specific in Mongolia. So what are the unique problems, the prominent or major issues of gender inequality and gender injustice in Mongolia? And because you're part of Feminist, so what programs do Feminist have to handle the gender inequality and gender justice, right? And how strong is gender equality movement in Mongolia? So if you could also mention about and share your experiences, what are the obstacles, the constraints and challenges in consolidating the movement in Mongolia? So please, the forum is yours.
Thank you. So Feminist is a network that got sort of revitalized, reformed, recast in 2007. And when we were going through this intensive process of formulating our vision or reformulating our vision, mission, and strategies, we expressly set the goal of movement building. And when we set the goal of movement building, we also envisioned it very broad, right? Not limited to women's rights organizations or those who work for gender equality, but civil society groups, not necessarily formally NGOs, even though in practice it is hard when you don't have money to be a national network that really involves everybody. You actually need money to be able to include people. And we wanted to sort of be inclusive, to be representative, and to be the bridge, basically, right? To let people stand on our backs, on our shoulders, to amplify their voices, and as much as possible, the marginalized groups. And I don't really like using, by the way, the term vulnerable groups, because I think the groups per se are not vulnerable. Vulnerability is not their innate feature. It is the marginalization and exclusion and discrimination that puts them in, at risk of violence and so on. So that was our goal, and we knew that we were going to work based on feminist principles as we articulated them in our context. And in our context, it was important to be comprehensive, because, as I said, this is a post-socialist country, and things like, democracy, human rights were very new, and social justice wasn't even in the picture in the first 15 years of activism. And later on, as we came to terms with and learned a lot from the Asia Pacific region, particularly from people-centered organizations. So we continuously developed our framework. So right now we say that we stand for human rights for all, for gender equality, for social justice, and for substantive democracy, and for environmental justice. So all of that together, because we don't see them as separate. And also from that time when we were recasting our vision, we based it on intersectional and post-colonial feminist analysis of patriarchy as a system. Patriarchy as a hegemonic system of power that uses gender, but also intersects with other systems of power, like capitalism, like urban-rural, divide, based on class, of course, related to capitalism, but also heteronormativity. Critique of heteronormativity was really important from the beginning. So all of it came from how we understand patriarchy and how we understand the building of democracy. So for post-socialist feminist activists, the notion of democracy is very important, and we've also struggled with redefining democracy substantively, because the transition took this, what is called among political scientists, minimal procedural definition of democracy, which just gives you elections, right? And then elections can be bought, and they are bought. And when elections are bought, you have the flourishing of corruption, right? And underlying this is, again, the socioeconomic inequality. So all of those things we take into account, and we have tried to further our analysis and deepen our analysis. And I think that is very much post-communist, right? So what is different about Mongolia, that kind of post-communist perspective, and our ability to go back and say, before socialism, actually, violence against women was not blatant as now. We didn't have sexual objectification of women in media, as is like proliferating now. And socioeconomic inequality between men and women was not as is now. We didn't have this level of poverty before, and so we can compare, all of these. And the other thing that I would say is quite not unique at all, but very Mongolian, is that for decades, women have led the development of civil society in Mongolia. And now the situation is actually, the socioeconomic political situation is worse and worse and worse. Through COVID, it's getting even worse. After COVID, I mean, it's just getting really, because what COVID is doing is very regressive, further redistribution, right? Making poor poorer, making those who are not poor poor, and allowing very few to actually use this opportunity of COVID to reinforce their power and wealth. So after this, I think we will face even more violence and crime. So in this situation, also, what we thought is the civil society space is shrinking, and again, not only in Mongolia, but I think our ability to lead in civil society is actually not growing. You know, you would think that we would have more experience and organizations would become established better and the civil society space would grow stronger. Actually, the opposite is happening. And the reason the opposite is happening is overall context, socioeconomic, political, but also the neoliberal funding mechanisms of international organizations, including UN organizations, which are based on competitive principle. On one hand, when they say civil society, they actually open up like, what was this partnership with private sector? So a lot of money actually does not go into civil activist organizations. And when money does come to activist organizations, it has always come for activities, not for administrative costs, which meant that NGOs, and again, I think this is true all over the world, have had to struggle to implement quote unquote projects without having enough money to build their organizations. So constantly struggling to deliver on projects while not being able to strengthen their organizations. And second, so it is a very exploitative scheme. And secondly, this neoliberal funding scheme that is based on competition actually divides NGOs. Instead of helping build solidarity and collective power, it goes precisely against it. And for an organization like Montfemnet, whose mission is to build a movement, we go against the grain at high level of sacrifice to ourselves as our bodies and our health and our families and our sanity, as well as our organizations. And I think there, we try as best as we can to build solidarity, you know, across. However, money, I think, is a critical issue, and the kind of money that we get is a critical issue. I don't know how that is going to get solved. So the other thing that we have done, maybe to link to masculinities, for us, Mongolian women's NGOs did not start from a place of vulnerability. When they began, independent NGOs began to form in the early 1990s, precisely the opposite. Women felt empowered and they wanted to pool their collective power, talents, and make a strong contribution to democratization, democratic development, you know, in the 90s. But over the years, you know, like, of course, the Western funders came and, oh, women's NGOs. And then they saw Mongolian women's NGOs through already neo-colonial eyes. That poor women, you know, poor Asian women, they are discriminated and they need to talk about their rights, not about other things like social development and democracy. But for us, from the beginning, because maybe we didn't come from a place of vulnerability, including men and boys was important, because we didn't really see how we can develop together if we leave the other half behind. And there weren't any organizations, and there are still not really any strong organizations that would bring young men along in terms of this, how political, social, education and literacy based on feminist principles, right? Based on human rights principles. So if we as women's rights organizations did not bring men along, then nobody would have. So we thought that it is our role to bring them along, right? And young people need to work in partnership with each other. And then the other part, of course, as I said from the beginning, critique of heteronormativity was very important. So we've made an effort to also gradually prepare the civil society space for LGBTIQ inclusion, and then make connections gradually and to mainstream to include LGBTIQ activists, and similar to other groups that are marginalized.
Oh, sorry, I was still muted. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Undaria, for your sharing. That's a very inspiring program from Mon Femnet. Yeah, and thank you for sharing the critical issue and the pervasive issues on gender inequality in Mongolia. So before I come to the next speaker, so I would like to ask the sign language interpreters, can both of you follow the discussion, the dialogue? Is it not too fast? Yulina, is it too fast, or can you interpret it?
Sometimes it's too fast.
Sometimes it's too fast?
Sometimes too fast, yeah.
Okay, all right, sorry about that. Really sorry about that. Yeah, I just like,
Yeah,
please, okay, please be mindful for all of the speakers and audience who would like to speak. Just like try not to speak too fast, because we need to give an opportunity to allow the sign language interpreter to interpret from English to Indonesian sign language. So, okay, thank you so much, Dr. Tumursuk. So next speaker is Daniela. Hi, Daniela. Okay, so
Hi.
first of all, I would like to say congratulations on having the first female vice president, Kamala Harris. So I think this is one of the achievement, right? Like the biggest achievement in the US, right? I think like most Americans, most women or LGBTIQ, communities, they're really happy, they're really glad about that. So how do you see this achievement of, having the first female vice president in the US after such a long history of feminist movement in the US? While we know, like in other countries, like in the global South or third world countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, women are already in the highest political position earlier, right, compared to the US. So, yeah, do you think that people in the US, like feel or think that women can be anything except president or vice president? And why? And how does, like the election of Harris as vice president of the US mean for gender equality movement in the US? So please, Daniela.
So I feel like a lot of what is going on, the resistance has to do with a patriarchal standing in the United States. And that's kind of still present within the US. You see most Eastern coasts, the Eastern coast, the Western coast, are a lot more liberal in ideology versus much of the internalness of the United States is still in a place where it's very conservative, and there are roles within that conservativeness where women are still seen as, not to be out of the home, right? Out of the home sphere, or the domestic sphere. So I think it definitely does help that to kind of break those barriers, or at least bend them, that there is a vice president. It's ironic that the United States is seen as such a global power, yet, like you mentioned, there are developing countries, what are seen as developing countries, post-colonial countries, that they've had women in power for much longer than we've had somebody in the Senate or Congress or whatnot. So.
Yeah, Yeah, thank you. Next question is, we know that the US has long been considered as the country with the stronger tradition of freedom and democracy, right? And what do you think, how does this freedom and democracy affect gender equality and sexual freedom in the US? And the feminist movement in the US, both in academia or also in activism and beyond, is among the most progressive ones, as we know that, like everybody knows that, right? Like US is the progressive ones in terms of the feminist movement, because we know the history, the long history of, you know, first wave feminism, second wave feminism, right? And it inspires tremendously global history of feminist movements, for sure. And with that long history, what can you tell us about the status of gender equality in the US right now? And what are the most crucial problems of gender inequality and gender injustice? And what are the most important achievements and what are the strongest challenges? Because as we know, the USA has never ratified CEDAW until now, right? Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
Mhm.
Yes, the USA signed it, but never has never ratified CEDAW. So what do you think about that?
So the first point was about freedom and democracy. I think the most important question to ask is freedom and democracy for who? Because it has been present, but for who? The majority of the time, it has been for white Protestant men in the United States. And then it comes later for white women. And you know, when you talk about the feminist movement in the United States, for example, it wasn't for every woman. It was for white women specifically. And then there was womanism, which involved women of color, and it went, you know, from there, so on and so forth. But with freedom and democracy, that rhetoric that's always discussed within the United States, and you know, I think it's such a diluted rhetoric of freedom and democracy, freedom and democracy, but people don't understand it's freedom and democracy, but for a certain group. And that's something to consider in relation to gender and gender, feminism, equality, equity for different groups and the intersectionality present there. So in terms of gender equality in the US right now, I can't speak for every state, but from what I do understand the state I am in Washington State. They do have some of the strongest laws in terms of domestic violence. So from what I took in my work, for example, this is a really micro concept, but if a woman or a man is in a domestic violence situation and they are living in an apartment, for example, they can get out of that situation by discussing it with a police officer, who in turn can discuss it with the landlord or the person who owns that property. So that's something that is very helpful for a domestic violence victim. And I think there's a myriad of different domestic violence issues present, and there is help, but there are loopholes. And this is something else I've discovered. There are loopholes because the places that can help you can only help you so much. They can only answer so many questions. And you are stuck in a rock. You're stuck in a hard place. It's a very difficult place if you have money, but you don't have enough money, right? If you have connections, but you don't have enough connections. So there is a gray area in between with domestic violence where those people are stuck and cannot be helped. And so there are still gray areas within the United States in terms of gender equality and specifically, discussing domestic violence, where it's a progression and it's getting there, but there are still loopholes that are exploited by perpetrators and by those representing perpetrators. So I would say that would be a really difficult challenge to get through, is kind of closing those loopholes and creating stronger and just creating stronger laws to protect victims of domestic violence. What was it? So, and the other portion was in relation to law enforcement. That is something else that I think ties in now, especially now within the United States. What we're seeing is a movement of Black Lives Matter in combination with police brutality. There's a lot to say about that. I think they should be, there's intersections there, but they should be treated separately, because police brutality is one thing, Black Lives Matter is another thing. The intersection should be discussed, but police brutality needs to be discussed a lot, because it intersects not only with people of color, but also when it comes to things like gender inequality, and specifically with domestic violence. For example, in the type of work that I was in, there would be police officers who were less empathetic than others. They didn't share too much sympathy. And you'd wonder whether or not it was because they understood what was happening, or did they understand and they didn't care? And, that kind of slurs the boundary of, what is police brutality? Is police brutality happening? Do they care? Do they not? Do they understand what is happening, but they don't care? Or do they genuinely don't understand the mindset of a domestic violence victim and why they continually repeat a cycle of power and abuse that's happening? So in terms of more enforcement and law, I believe it's necessary to have some sort of sensitivity training for law enforcement, or what a lot of people have suggested currently is to not have law enforcement go to domestic issues, but rather social workers or another branch to handle that. So that is a suggestion there that people have kind of brought up.
Thank you, Daniela. So Daniela is an anti-activist of anti-domestic violence. And let's talk about domestic violence in the US for a minute. So I think, you said that USA has one of the strongest laws of domestic violence, right? And then, but well, there is a contradictory situations if we're talking about a domestic violence in the US. Well, I'm part of the a group on Facebook, right, on domestic. It's called Domestic Violence Awareness Issues on Facebook in the US, right? Because currently I live in the US. I live in New York, and it's horrible because it's not only the number of cases is going up every day, but also the form of violence, domestic violence, like it involves torturing, it involves murdering, shooting. So that's terrible. So this is like contradictory. On one hand, yeah, USA has like the strongest, right, one of the strongest laws of domestic violence, but on the other hand, like the cases is rising. like
One
every
of
day.
right, and that actually brings me to another point is when it comes to federal law even of domestic violence, it only considers physical domestic violence, not emotional, not mental.
Mm.
If that person has markings, that's physical domestic violence, and that gets covered by a protection order or an or a protection order. I'm not recalling what the other one is called, but only if it's physical, right? And so what happens if you are emotionally abused, right? Or it's some other type of abuse that doesn't get covered. And so that's another loophole. That is a big loophole that only really it's nonprofits that handle that situation. But when you need legal protection, there's only so much that can be done for that person. And that's, one of the biggest concerns for victims of domestic violence is the legal help, just sometimes it's not there.
Okay, so that's not enough, right? You're saying that it's not enough to have like strong legal system to handle domestic violence, right? And your suggestion is to have like training, sensitivity training, or law enforcement. It's not only the law, right, the legal, but the law enforcement. And what necessary efforts do you think can be done to eliminate domestic violence in the US? And what are the root causes of domestic violence in the US, you think? Like in Washington State, for instance, where you live in?
So from what I understand in terms of root causes, it has to do a lot with power and control. Domestic violence definitely is, there's a lot of confusion of, well, what's the difference between me just being rude to my partner versus it being domestic violence? And the root issue there is power and control. You want to have power and control over another person, whether that's emotionally or physically, any other type of abuse. You want to have a certain power and control over that person, financially, over children, over their emotions, over their family, removing them from their family, isolating them. So it's definitely those type of that type of system that occurs with domestic violence, where it is everywhere. It is not just in impoverished neighborhoods. Like, that's a big misconception. Statistically, it happens everywhere, even in very affluent neighborhoods. So that's something to understand within the United States, is domestic violence is not an issue of class. It's not an issue of money. It's an issue of something bigger, right? Whether it's, I guess, a root cause of like patriarchy, or some people tout religion, others tout maybe culture. Oh, it's these people do it most or whatnot. Whatever the root cause is, it's important to understand that it all goes back to power and control.
Thank you, Daniela. I'll get back to you later. I'll come to the next speaker. To our third speaker is Mbak Yunianti Huzaifa. Hi, Mbak Yuni.
Hi.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna start asking questions to you. Well, as we know that Indonesia is the largest Muslim majority country, right? And I think everybody knows that that's the largest, like number one. And then the second one is Pakistan. Well, some people say that and referred Indonesia as a good example of progressive social movements, including feminist movements, right? And what's your take on that view? And in what aspect Indonesia can be a good example of gender equality movement, for other countries, for other contexts in which Muslim or Islam plays an influential role. And what's your opinion on some people, some communities in Indonesia use religion, mostly Islam, to justify gender-based violence, for instance, right? Or violence against women. They use in the name of religion, and they committed violence against other gender minorities, for instance, or sexual minorities. Please, Mbak Yuni, you could respond to questions.
Thank you, Ira, and other previous speakers, and also to Let's Talk. This is a great initiative to have really illuminating discussion and various topics. Okay. It's a bit difficult to answer about the good conclusion and good impression that Indonesia has as a good example of Muslim feminist movement, gender equality in the Muslim context. I would say yes and no. Okay, but the most important thing possibly I could share about the trajectory of how the synergy between gender equality movement and also connecting with the issue of religion. I remember in 1995, at that time, feminist movement and also gender equality movement, strongly giving training awareness in many contexts. But finally, we thought that why the education already equal and also some opportunity is already there, but violence against women, especially among religious groups, still there, using religion as a for the justification. For justification. That's why at that time the gender activists or feminist movement tried to embrace religious leaders, especially religious leader from Muslim religious leader, to talk about what is the root causes and what kind of theology that has been used for the justification of those violence. And we start from very low profile issues using reproductive health that considered as unpolitical. This is talking about health issues, but at that time unavoidable when we talk about the health, even reproductive issues. It is talking about the private issues, talking about sexuality, talking about power, about the negotiation, and finally talking about the public authority, about the public issues, hard politics, etc. So this is why the connectivity and between gender feminists and also Islam at that time, quite strong. And if lately we saw, for instance, ulama, Women Muslim Ulama Congress or Women Cleric Congress, Islamic Women Cleric Congress, that this is, I think, not a sudden result. This is long trajectory because, women's movement in Indonesia, for instance, like Fatayat, Muslimat, Aisyah, even formally in the organization, not easy, to negotiate about women's rights, but they try to, to open another windows to negotiate about rights. For instance, in Muhammadiyah, they have progressive opinion about female genital mutilation. That this is, not strong religious legitimacy. This is harmful practices. And even in Nahdlatul Ulama, possibly they have different opinion, but some of activists from this big mass organization having progressive opinion, and they wrote in the media, they have their own community talking in the social media as another space to negotiate, to find, to widening a space for negotiation with, using the religious opinion. Possibly this is the reason why people considering that Indonesian Muslim feminists contributing, to the women's rights. Other second that I think we have to be aware that mostly we consider that movement or activism come from, middle upper class. But in fact, if we see from from Indonesian experience, because my PhD research on Indonesian migrant workers to Saudi Arabia, this is really clear. And I try to use analysis from the transnationalism from below. It is clear that the agent of movement, not only from those upper class, but migrant domestic workers, migrant workers, contributing a lot to negotiating women's rights through their daily experience. For instance, women migrant workers migrate to Saudi Arabia or to another countries, and they questioning about the rights to be who are the head of family, asking to the religious authority. If the definition of head of family, it should be men, and because they are breadwinner, and the women, those migrant workers asking, at the moment we are the breadwinners. So can religion also open a possibility for us as a head of family, for instance? So this is another negotiation process, how the migrant workers, the grassroots women contributing to open wider space of rights to another women. I think they contribute a lot to negotiate, about gender equality from the religious perspective, and based on their own experience. And I would like also to touch about the issue of global solidarity as well. What happening in Indonesia, I think this is inseparable from the global dynamic as well. For instance, at the moment, KUPI, the Indonesian Muslim Women Ulama Congress, using new methodology of lived realities. This is possibly the first contribution that the ulama or the cleric using human rights as a basic Quran, Hadith, and human rights, environment consideration as a basic of the religious fatwa or decision. And also, the most important thing is based on lived realities as a basic negotiation of the rights. And this is, happened because strongly connected to the global movement Musawa, and this methodology also contribute a lot to the dynamic of Islamic women's movement in Indonesia. And when you ask about the challenge, I think yes. At the moment, the main challenge of gender equality of feminist movement in Indonesia is the trend of anti-rights movement. And also some of them twisting human rights, freedom to harm, asking freedom to harm the women's right, and also violence, justifying violence against women through the, theology. And those hardliners movement or noisy movement, they are, harvesting the result of the feminist movement. But afterward, backlash happened through many levels of space. For instance, they start from the local regulation using democracy to take a start through legislation process by producing discriminatory bylaws, for instance, obligating women to wear headscarf, especially among the civil servants. Wearing headscarf, also another issues, of course. But when the state take over and collaborating with religion to control women's freedom, this is issues that feminist movement questioning. And also the another level that they try to play is also using some of them become parliament members, but to become parliament members, they also, hindering the legislation of gender equality law, sexual violence law, by politicizing homophobic about LGBT issues. So translating intersectionality is uneasy at all in the Muslim society context, because, for instance, they refuse and popularizing this resistance through the issue of LGBT, and easily they said disagree of sexual violence law because contents of LGBT issues. They disagree about gender mainstreaming law because contents of same-sex marriage, etc., etc. Without reading carefully, without understanding the root of causes and also issues. This is another issues. And the third challenge is also even the terrorist movement at the moment using the spirit of gender equality. For instance, recruiting women as a perpetrator of terror. This is also another challenge at the moment in Indonesia. This is some comments from me. Ira?
This is very interesting and inspiring sharing. So I would like to follow up your statement, your explanation about the role of feminist movement, especially Muslim feminists or Islamic feminists. So why do you think that a lot of feminist, Muslim feminists or Islamic feminists, right, do not talk about sexual and gender diversities or minority in Indonesia? Why do they always talk about like the relations between women and men, but not the gender and sexual minorities?
Yes, I think they do not avoid to talk about gender diversity, but they really we have to be smart to choose what strategic a strategic approach that we need to choose. For instance, when we talk about the LGBT issues, we never talk without involving circle of the LGBT activist movement. Some of them, we always asking their consideration whether we would like to bring these issues publicly or what. And sometimes they said no, because when, hello?
Yeah, Mbak. Go ahead.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Because, yes, when we talk about the LGBT issues, for instance, about sexual diversity, we cannot bring everything publicly because sometimes, we're inviting serious discrimination and also persecution against them. This we really have to be careful to choose which one we have to bring as a public opinion and which one we have to to talk in more consolidated situation. That way, the strategy that we try to do is first documenting the issues, we encourage, the LGBT groups to documenting violence against women they face, and also discrimination. So hopefully this is become a eyes opener for public who misleading, misunderstanding about the LGBT issues. So to build sympathy, to build better and clarity about the issue of LGBT. And we also invite religious leaders to hear the problem of LGBT group in a limited discussion. And I know that some of them, those ulama, at that time we asked, please, if you don't support the LGBT, but please avoid to blame them. But lately, if you see some ulama start, start to understand, and they are in the position of using rights based to give opinion publicly, avoid to speak that inviting more serious risk to the LGBT group. So this is matter of strategy. But if you see some of feminist movement, we talk strongly, publicly against persecution. We talk about the economic rights of trans women who banned in working in some areas. You will see about this in some public statement. And at the moment as well, another in this context of current dynamic of Indonesia. Lately, we have big issues of ketahanan keluarga, the family resilience law, bill, and this has become a serious issues because we have to contest. This has become a contesting notion. Some of hardliners group using family resiliency to prevent feminism that, according to them, contributing to worsening the family relationship, because a lot of divorce, about a lot of violence against women because of they know about feminism. Challenging, disagree, and also living family, etc., etc. So at the moment, feminist movement also try to negotiate that feminism and gender equality is also very important pillars for the family resiliency. So we are at the moment contesting the notion about what's family resiliency in different meaning and from different point of view. This is my point, Ira.
Yeah, thank you,
Okay.
Bayuni. That's very important issue that you brings up in this discussion. That especially like the current issue in Indonesia about gender injustice and gender inequality. So you mentioned about the religion, right? There are a lot of communities or a lot of people that use religion to justify or to legitimize violence against women or gender-based violence. And the other one you mentioned about anti-right movement, right? And well, this is also comes to my mind about the relationship between feminism and Islam, right, in Indonesia especially. So there is a study by Rachel Rinaldo's Mobilizing Piety. I think most all of us know that book. So she concluded that women's rights movement in Indonesia provide an important lesson of how Islam is compatible, right, with feminism, vice versa. So rather than contradictory, this is not contradictory. So drawing from your long experiences as women's human rights activists and gender equality advocate in Indonesia, so how do you reflect on that conclusion, by Rachel Rinaldo? And the second one is, we know that Indonesia is extraordinarily rich with religious organizations and institutions and figures, right? And in what way those organizations, like religious organizations and institutions and figures, are a big challenge for gender equality, and in what way are they key supporter of gender equality and justice?
Yes. Okay, Ira. So from my reflection that Muslim feminist movement contribute to the women's rights in Indonesia. For instance, lately, the child marriage at increasing minimum age from 16 to 19. This is, I think, also contribution of women ulama, especially women ulama Congress. And I remember when I was at the UN for the Universal Periodic Review, the government proudly, proudly introducing KUPI, the Women Ulama Congress in the UN, that the women ulama strongly declared a fatwa against child marriage. So I think this is the real contribution of Muslim feminist movement. And also not only with Muslim feminist movement, but the movement itself, we never isolating ourselves, but always collaborating with other religion, with the indigenous women movement that they, for instance, in eastern part of Indonesia, they have kawin tangkap or forced marriage, and this is contributing, those experience contributing to as a basic experience for the advocacy, and we always collaborating and building alignment with other groups, and other why it sounds like compatible. Sometimes we have to to be smart. For instance, when we talk about female genital mutilation, that locally we use term of sunat perempuan. When we use those Islamic term, sunnah, it means what do you call it? Sunnah is, what is sunnah in English? It is a better and the better practice. Not better practice. A sunnah is promoted. So we try to disassociate those terms by using we try to avoid not using religious term, because if we use religious term, the religious leaders will say that, oh, this is FGMC is part of religious teaching. So at the moment, for instance, like a Komnas Perempuan at the beginning tried to use Indonesian term that we call pemotongan dan pelukaan. So this is like a FGMC but at the local language. So this is more acceptable as a cultural negotiation to eradicate harmful practices by using another strategic term. And also this is contribution from women mass organization, because the women ulama Congress mostly from big mass organization like Nahdlatul Ulama and also Muhammadiyah, and also another contribution that we also collaborate with the universities. For instance, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, because at that time I was like a gender advisor for Islamic universities. So we try to introduce curricula on gender equality at some universities, so some Islamic universities, and they have strong women Center for Women Studies who introduce gender equality in the environment of the academia. So I think this is also a real contribution of how Islam and feminism and gender, it is not in the contradictory position. And my, my last point, yes, I think this is, I can continue later, Ira.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah, thank you, Mbak Yuni. Okay, I can Now I'll move to our next speaker, Shamila Daluwate. So Shamila is a lawyer, and she's from Sri Lanka, but currently she lives in the US, in Rhode Island. Well, it is, since Mbak Yuni already mentioned about female genital mutilation, one of the local practice, right, in especially in like African country and Asian country, and still existing now. So we know that laws and other legal products on gender equality, right, and gender justice produced by both or either international organizations or the states are often seen as a challenge against local cultural norms, system, and authority. So what's your view on this specific issue? And do you think that this conflict also happened in the case of Sri Lanka? And relating to that problem as well, how difficult is it to be a lawyer of gender-based violence cases? And how do you solve or overcome these difficulties? Shamila, you could respond to those questions. Thank you. Oh, you're still muted. Wait, let me ask you.
Sorry. Hi.
That's okay.
Thank you, Ira.
Go ahead. Yeah, no problem.
So thank you for the other speakers also that they already highlighted the harmful practices and gender-based violence. And so, I mean, if you look at all these harmful practices in the world, starting from India, sati, and like widows burning over a funeral, death of a husband, and law, it is the power of law prohibited the practice of sati, so that we prevented gender-based violence, especially against women, because of law, the practice of law and the power of law. So we need laws to eliminate gender-based violence. Now, even if you look at data, female genital mutilation. So when I look at data from UN Women, 200 million people from 31 countries went through female genital mutilation up to now. That means still continuing. Even if we have law and policies around the world, still the practice is continuing. And look at other harmful practices. I work in Afghanistan. So I saw women were married off to settle family dispute. So let's say that two families or warlord, they fight over an issue. Then you have a practice called bath. That means you settle, you marry off your young girl to settle a family dispute. This is still continuing in Afghanistan. Let's take Nepal, for example. They have practice of chaupadi in certain parts, not everywhere. And so during menstruation time, so these women or young girls, they have to spend their time in the hut, away from family members. And the practice of when I was in Aceh, so I don't know whether some people might not agree with me, the practice of idda, the waiting time in the event of death of your husband. So this also, during this time, some women lost their entitlement to land or any livelihood support. I see acid throwing because of dowry practices still in Bangladesh, and honor killing in the name of religion, in the name of custom, in the name of culture. So even if we have policies and laws all over the world, like, can you hear me?
Yes, sure. We can hear you.
Like Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, we have seen a lot of gender-based violence. So there are a lot of global solidarity. If you see Me Too movement and 1 billion rising, according to 1 billion rising, 1 in 3 women have experienced gender-based violence or violence against women in their lifetimes. And then we have 16 days activism and Arrange the World and He for She campaign. There is a huge global movement, global solidarity. Despite all these movements, all these laws and policies, still gender-based violence continue up to date. So when we think about gender-based violence, we don't even talk about men and boys. I mean, at the hands of warlords, young boys were sexually assaulted in Afghanistan and other countries, even in Syria or Yemen. As in many countries, LGBTQI people face harassment, day-to-day humiliation, because we do not support we don't have laws even in Sri Lanka or many Asian countries to allow their right to marry, to live with their partners. So the law, I mean, we have laws, but law does not necessarily protect and prevent gender-based violence against human beings. This is basically I want to say, but there are good things, like if you look at 155 countries have domestic violence laws. Earlier, partner violence did not even recognize. They say, oh, it's okay that a husband can slap your wife because this is your husband. And, sorry about it. 140 countries have sexual harassment laws that discriminate sexual harassment at work. So we have laws, but the thing is we have to implement laws, and we need support, we need funds. Otherwise, we can't seek justice at court because law is expensive. And sometimes people have to go 100 miles to find a lawyer or a court system. Over.
Okay. Thank you, Shamila. So you have experience working with UN Women, right? And that strongly campaigns for universal women's rights. You are from Sri Lanka and you worked in Banda Aceh, Indonesia. So those two areas where local cultures or local adat, like people, indigenous people or people living with customary law in Indonesia, play a very important role, right, in their life. How do you reflect on your experiences and backgrounds to advocate universal women's rights on the one hand, and to build cultural understanding and respect on the other hand? Because like you said, we still have a lot of, like communities, like local communities, right, still use their cultures to maybe in the UN women terms, it is violence, like female genital mutilation, for instance, or dowry, like you said, or the examples that you just brought up in this discussion. So how do you balance that, right? On one hand, I mean, like, we need to advocate universal women's rights, but on the other hand, we need to build cultural understanding and respect to those cultural norms and, like the local cultures.
Yes, I would say like we all are human beings. At the same time, we are cultural beings. So we operate in a culture that religion, media, school, religious institution, ulamas, they play a key role. So now when I was working in Banda Aceh, Indonesia, we work with ulama council, we work with ex-combatants. And so we convert this CEDAW convention on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women with Islam. So we can converge beautifully, because a lot of people say this convention on CEDAW or Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Torture Convention, these are Western. But I don't agree that these are Western. If you look at all the religions with constitutions or your own CEDAW framework, all these rights are necessarily embedded in your culture or religion. So I remember we converge in front of Allah's eyes, both men and women are equal. So we have same article in the convention. In front of law, both men and women are equal, Article 15. So you converge beautifully. So this is nothing to do with the Western values. It is in your own religion. So women's rights are in your religion, whether it's Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam. So we have to have a framework of converging Islam framework with CEDAW or human rights framework. However, there are a lot of bad things in the religion as well, if you look at all the religions. So we have to only take good things about non-violence and compassion, love, kindness in the religion and apply for human human rights based perspective. This is how we work in Aceh, try to converge the women's rights framework to the religion, to the Islamic framework. And the earlier ulama council member, they did not accept the women's rights framework, but when we try to convert this approach, oh, they said, okay, this is nothing to do with Western values, it's in our religion. Even we took examples of how do you discriminate a widow when Prophet Muhammad married a widow 15 years older than him. So we took stories, even from our own religion, Buddhism, we took stories to tell faith-based value and human rights framework, women's rights framework. So that was an approach we use it. However, we had to work with other areas. In media, every day, if you look at 100 advertisement, more than 90% they portray women as cooking, washing, cleaning people, but we have women engineers, uh, we have lawyers, doctors, but we do not portray women as leaders. Most of the time, they portray as like women as someone who's engaging in reproductive role only, sharing, rearing, and childbearing. So we have to promote women as positive role models. Lot of women in Asia and Africa, in many countries, women spend more hours in collecting water and firewood, but they also don't have time. That's called time poverty. So if we want to empower women, we have to work with religion, media, school. Then we have to change their how we portray women in the media. So we have to change lot of things actually, not only, and also politics. So like look at parliaments in all over the world. Like in Sri Lanka, for example, we produced the first female prime minister to the world in 1960. Where are we now? We do not have, our parliamentarians are like less than 6%. So we have to work in political sphere, social, economic, as well as environmental, all the fields. We have to promote women and also prevent gender-based violence.
Yeah, thank you, Shamila. Thank you for the fruitful discussion. I would like to go to our next speaker, Maria Rashid. Maria, are you here? She disappeared. Okay, so maybe Sharon. Sharon, well, the Philippines look different, right, from other countries in Southeast Asia. So a lot of people say that it is America in Asia or in Southeast Asia, right, as it is seen to deeply engage in American, quote unquote, American cultural appropriation, including in terms of gender and sexuality. How do you respond to that view? So having a close social and cultural connection with the US, right? Is there any local gender norms in the Philippines, or they are all Americanized? And how diverse are sexual and gender identities in the Philippines? Because there is one book that I remember, I used that book. It's written by Martin Manalansang. It's called Global Divas. It's about the ways Filipino gay adapt and negotiate American and Filipino gay culture. They're still engaged in American gay cultures, like going to gay bar, for instance, but still keep and maintain the Filipino identity. So what do you think about that?
Okay, before anything else, I would like to thank you for giving me this opportunity to be part of this very important endeavor. It is true, it is very true that the Philippines is very Americanized. I think in the entire Southeast Asia, the Philippines is the most Americanized. And this is primarily because the Americans, our former colonizers, used education as its handmaiden, or handmaiden of colonial policy. They used education they use education as a tool to control the minds of the people. So in that sense, many of the American culture have influenced the Filipinos. But at present, the way we look at gender and sexuality, actually, it's a product of the indigenous, the influences we had in the past, and of course, the new developments. For instance, I can cite two examples of local gender identity. We have this concept called the babaylan. The babaylan is a pre-colonial figure. She is a cultural, political, religious leader, and she represented social and political leadership. The concept of the babaylan is now being used by the present generation as an inspiration to fight for and continue on with our movement towards gender equality. Another concept which is local is the concept of bakla. Bakla is a Tagalog term. This is often mislabeled by the Westerners as gay, but actually bakla is not equivalent to gay. Bakla is it's between gay, queer, and it's more of cultural, performative cultural function rather than sexual. So those two concepts are local, I think. But in the end, just like any society, I can say that at present, in the Philippines, the gender identity is, or majority of the Filipinos' gender identity is the same as their birth assigned sex. But through the years, and as time goes by, many are identifying as transgender, as non-variant or non-conforming gender or genderqueer. And the society is also becoming more open on issues regarding sex and gender.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is very interesting story because like different, right, from other Southeast Asian countries, the close relationship, between the Philippines and the US. So how that specific like social, political, and cultural situation that you mentioned, and the close relations with America gives gender equality movements in the Philippines advantages and disadvantages. What do you think the disadvantages and advantages to have like close relationship with the US? And as far as we understand, like churches have a key role in social political life, right? And the Filipino societies, right? And do you think that it also happens in terms of the gender issues? How do you leverage, how do you take advantage of the role of churches for promoting gender equality and gender justice in the Philippines? And finally, I would like you to share the strengths and the shortcomings of gender equality movement in the Philippines.
Okay, so for the social, political, and other developments in society, these new developments pose new challenges to the gender equality movement. Like, for instance, I would say that the present dispensation, the present administration is very misogynistic and sexist. So it tends to undermine the earlier gains by the feminists, not only the feminist movement, but the overall the gender equality movements in the country. Insofar as the impact of American culture and the different developments in the different spheres in society are concerned, there are advantages and disadvantages. For example, the developments right now in the US are, we can say, would impact, could impact negatively or positively to our people. But what I can say definitely is that I think we're ahead of the US in terms of gender equality. As mentioned earlier, countries in the global south, uh, many countries in the global south, or many countries which are considered as third world countries, had experiences with female leaders in the past. It's only now that the US elected their very first vice president. So I would say that, of course, we are affected with the developments in the US, though indirectly. Some gives us inspiration. For example, the tendency to be more open, the tendency to be more progressive. But I think more are homegrown, or more of the things that we have achieved in the past are more indigenous rather than effects of external factors or pressures. And in terms of the role being played by the Catholic Church is still a very strong and dominant institution in the Philippines. But again, through the years, many have challenged the role being played by the Catholic Church, particularly on issues regarding sex and gender. For instance, the Catholic Church vehemently opposed the passing of the reproductive law. That's why it took 14 years for the said law to be passed. But in the end, the proponents won because the people supported the law, and discourse like rights, social justice were used to counter and to rebut the claims made by the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church said that the said law, the said bill, before it became a law, is anti-God and anti-people, and is part of the so-called death legislation. Death stands for divorce. What's the second one? Euthanasia. What's the third one? Abortion, total population, and homosexuality. So what is happening now in the country is that many are challenging the hegemony of the Catholic Church. This is happening slowly because until today we have yet to come up with a same-sex law or a divorce law. But there is light at the end of the tunnel because people are learning to contest and to challenge the hegemony of the church.
Yeah, so there's still like opportunity, right? I mean, like to challenge the church, and also I think like to also ask church to collaborate, right, to promote gender equality. There is like an opportunity. And then that's the inspiring story that you mentioned about people power, that people power win, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, thank you for your stories and experience. So I will come
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maria. So you just like disappeared before. So you just kicked out, right, from the Zoom. Okay, so last but not least, Maria Rashid. She's from Pakistan. So what do you think the specific or unique problems or issues of gender inequality and injustice in Pakistan? So like that are different from the problems in other Asian and Islamic countries or the country with Muslim majority? Because number one, the largest one is Indonesia and the second one is Pakistan. So based on those problems, what do you think the analytical knowledge and understandings that we, all of us, can learn from Pakistan to consolidate movements against gender inequality and gender injustice? Yes, please, you could respond to those questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sorry, I signed out because my internet collapsed for some reason.
It's fine.
To shut down and come back on. But I'm glad I'm back again. So with reference to your question, I mean, I think it's a delicate question, isn't it? I mean, I think other speakers have talked about this issue of specificity versus very much the commonality in that women in very patriarchal and very capitalist societies all over the world face. But certainly, yes, there is a uniqueness to the Pakistan case and the question of women, which I think has to do with its history as a post-colonial state and also its geostrategic location, where it has served as a client state during the Cold War, and also resulting, and then the politicization of women.
And also its geostrategic location
There's an
where it
echo. I
has
can
served
hear
as a
my own.
client
Yeah, it's
state
echo.
during the Cold War.
Okay. Okay, you think that's better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
Much better.
So in terms of increasing militarization of state and society because of politicization of religion during the Cold War, and that's something that we've lived with as far back as the partition from India itself. And so for Pakistan, much of Pakistan, so I'd like to draw attention to militarization specifically in the context of Pakistan. So we have in the 75 years, 74 years of existence, we've been ruled for more than half of this time by the military directly, and then at times indirectly for much of the rest of the time indirectly, whether it's through control of foreign policy and active interference in military in domestic politics. So we carry this legacy from the beginning of Pakistan's history, and then of course intensified during when we acted as client state, and then the continuing war on terror, where we are very much a frontline state. So within that context, when it comes to the women's question, when you talk about women in Pakistan, we know that women lag behind men in education, political, and labor force participation, also in areas like ownership and control of productive assets. And they face challenges in access to health, reproductive services, and harassment and violence is a very everyday occurrence for women in various settings, whether it's home, whether it's workplaces, and in public spaces. And of course, these indicators of various quote unquote empowerment, vary across class, provincial, and provincial locations and rural urban divides. And I think one of the major challenges that faces Pakistan right now, which has strong bearing on the women issue, is the fact that we have very poor governance and a very fragile democratic process, which in some ways has really weakened the state's ability to respond to the issues that women face. And we also have this, what is this phenomena called resurgent patriarchies, where, over the years, there's a constant attempt to resist what is, a movement in a positive direction as far as women. So women's equality is perceived as questioning and disrespecting religious interpretations, norms, and customary notions of justice. And this challenge to social norms and religious interpretation is further compounded when women's lives, including their voice and agency, become arenas that are highly susceptible to being used as a ground for political mobilizing. So the bodies and the lives of women in Pakistan have time and time again been a ground for these battles where, so for example, as far back as in the early 1980s, when General Zia, which was our second military coup, came up with very discriminatory laws and policies around women, in his drive for Islamization to get legitimacy. And then as recent as in 2000 from 2003 to 2009, in areas where bombing of girls' schools and in certain parts in the northern parts of the country by the Taliban, by extremist militants, basically. So it's only fair to say that despite progress that has been made in terms of education, legislation, representation in parliament, the status of women remains in a very intense area of contestation, where successive governments, whether they're military or civilian or anti-state elements like the militants, have used women, their bodies, as symbols of their own ideology and put their own agenda out. So we're in this uncomfortable middle often. And since many of you have spoken about gender-based violence, and that remains a critical issue at the heart of women's movements. So Pakistan obviously has a range of harmful cultural practices, and also religious persecution in the form of minority women being forcibly converted to and married to Muslim men. So violence against women in Pakistan remains at an all-time high, despite a series of pro-women legislation, which started around as our more democratic regimes kicked in around 2006 onwards. So gender violence is an issue which is critical to Pakistan, and it's affected by very inadequate criminal justice systems and patriarchal norms that shame the victim. And norms that are further mirrored by state and political officials. The state provides very poor or at best limited safety nets or support systems to women facing violence. And survivors of violence who stand up for their rights not only challenge the right of the abuser to violate them, but also contest very deeply entrenched gender order, which is institutionalized in the very systems that are supposedly out to protect them and provide justice. In Pakistan, only 2 of our 4 provinces have domestic violence legislation, and even in those provinces where they exist, they continue to be riddled by flaws. And in the other provinces, there's been heavy religious lack of support and active resistance by religious parties to pass this legislation. When I say religious, I'm speaking specifically about Islam, of course. So and also, I think in the context of South Asia, but also, of course, I've talked specifically of Pakistan, there's not been enough discussion and debate on what I think is an inadequacy of response of feminist, response to gender-based violence. For example, the focus has been on criminalization and punishment of the abuser, and an end to impunity for violence against women, which is of course critical, but we also know that laws are not enough, and implementation is an area which is a huge problem right now. And also the question of what lies beyond criminalization of violence. So because a lot of women do not know where to go after they leave an abusive home. So the roots of vulnerability to this violence are tied to women's economic, political, racial, and ethnic vulnerabilities in Pakistan, which is very much connected to patriarchal and very militarized state. And we know that violence in the home and in the workplace rests on a division of labor that restricts women to access to paid work, leaving her with limited ability to leave an abusive relationship, stand up to exploitation in the workplace, or be visible as sufferers in various military conflicts that we've been involved in. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to other questions that you have.
Okay, yeah, thank you to provide a complete information. From first-hand speaker with first-hand experiences. I think, like the life, like you said, that the life of women becomes contestation. I think like not only in the Pakistan, but also I think like everywhere, right, all over the globe. And you mentioned about the progress of women's movement or gender equality movement in Pakistan, like education legislation, but that's not enough, right? Well, I would like to go back to you later, Dr. Rashid, is that okay? So I would like to give an opportunity for our colleague, Mbak Aida Milasari. I think we also need to listen from her. She's a feminist activist who worked for quite long time. She has like a long experience working in an organization called Rumpun Gema Perempuan, or literally in English, Women's Voices, focus on female domestic workers working in Indonesia. And I think it's very important. Her work and other colleagues also very important to gender equality movement in Indonesia, and how the work on domestic workers with gender equality movements also correlates each other. And I think Aida Milasari could also share with us, because right now Aida and her colleagues work on advocating the rights of female domestic workers, and they are in the middle of advocating the legislation of the bill on the protection of domestic workers. So you could share your experience and your notion about that, Aida, please. Forum is yours.
Hi,
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Ira, Farid, and this beautiful event. regarding your questions about the issue of female domestic workers in Indonesia, it has been, we are working in this advocacy about the last 30 years. And the last 15 years, we submit the draft of legislation to Parliament, but still now it's pending, not discussed in Parliament yet. Why? Because the issue of female domestic workers is is marginalized issue. Regarding the state, this is not important, and we know that most of the member of Parliament in Indonesia have female domestic workers in their home. For example, they have 2, 3, until 5 domestic workers. And they also hire child domestic labor. So when we submit the legislation, the draft bill of domestic workers protection for the decent work, they reject our proposal. They reject our draft bill. But still the campaign is still going on. Because it is advocated by a woman activists and also scholars, academics, and also journalists. Some of our colleagues, our friends in journalists spread the issue of the domestic workers, the respected, yeah, of domestic workers through media. So people get more attention about this and raising their awareness. We aware that this issue is very difficult to advocate. For instance, because the society and the state still consider domestic workers as non-valuable work in patriarchy, in the race, class, and because of the low level of education, low bargaining position, they still become the lowest status of women work as informal workers in informal sectors. So it's really hard and very, very difficult to work, but we keep asking people, keep persuading many people to campaign for this issue, and we hope this year Parliament will put these issues as the priority issue to be discussed by the member of the Parliament. Yeah, my kitchen.
It's so cute.
Because I'm talking and she look at me. Yeah, and this is why we consider the issue have to be supported by all people in local level, in national level, and international level, because domestic workers of Indonesia are also spread out in Middle East and also many countries. As the migrant domestic workers, as what Yuni Huzaifa said, as the migrant domestic workers, they are also marginalized and vulnerable to violence, vulnerable to sexual harassment, vulnerable to physical violence, and for the issue of economic situation, this is the low level jobs. They get very little salary. As you know, Ira, in Indonesia, in Parung, you know, yeah, when you're in Indonesia, you know, there was domestic workers pay only 600,000. Do you remember, Ira?
Yeah.
In Parung, yeah. What? How much is in dollar? I don't know. How much dollar in 600,000 rupiah for a month? So it's very little, kan? So they live in very difficult situation. In this COVID, in this pandemic, they still suffer because they are suspect, suspicion. The employer suspicious. They bring COVID in their home, so they are fired. Many of our our colleagues in Tangerang Selatan, in South Tangerang, in one of community we organize, many of them are fired because of the pandemics, because of the suspicion. So they don't have any work, and they are jobless now, and the situation become very difficult. So this is the situation I want to share to everyone. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you,
Mbak
Ira.
Aida Milasari.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing for that. So I would like to read some questions in the chat. That's a lot already, but I can't really ask the speakers to answer all your questions. I just take some. There's a questions. I think I could ask Daniela first. This is from Abel. How to combat exploitation against women in popular culture, in movies or songs? You could answer to that, Daniela, please.
Exploitation. I think there's a line. There's a gray area in terms of what we consider exploitation in Western culture, because for a lot of women, sexuality can be seen as empowering, and a lot of women don't see that. So there's a lot of gray area there. I think an important factor to consider if you like to find ways to empower women in that realm would be consent, however that looks. Specifically for in an age range, consider consent in terms of children. Like, I'm not sure entirely if children can consent to them being nude in movies. For example, there is a movie called Blue Lagoon with Brooke Shields. She's a very famous actress. She was 15 and she was pretty much naked in the movie. This happened in the 70s or 80s, and you have to consider that. Did they have her consent for that? What does consent mean for a child? Do they even understand what's happening? And so that's one of the issues present with consent in terms of age. And then as you kind of cross that boundary of age and go into older women past the legal age, there are other boundaries that you have to also consider. So definitely I would think that one of those things to consider would be consent in terms of sexuality and the issue with exploitation of sexuality in women.
Okay, thank you, Daniela. So there's a question in the chat to Shamila from Icha Chahayani. So the question is, do the Indian and Sri Lankan governments fully support the activities of women activists? And also in the Sri Lankan government or India highly uploading cultural values as a national identity and attraction to know India from its culture? Could you respond to that, Samila? Are you still muted? Could you unmute? Okay.
Yes, I think in terms of the current government in Sri Lanka, I don't see the necessary support because we had a cabinet post for Minister of Women's Affairs, and it has been a struggle forever for the women's movement. Like sometimes we have a cabinet post just for women. The next time they amalgamate with children, again with children with disability. So we do not have this strong women's ministry. Right now, the current government even abolished that post in Sri Lanka. And India also, you see that religious fundamentalism and all this polarization. And India also suffer, the women's movement suffer because of this extreme government intervention with women's affairs. And I don't think necessary support from the government, but we have a very strong women's movement and very historical women's movement, and very I have met so many women, strong women advocates from India and Sri Lanka, South Asian, Pakistan, and all other countries. So right now, I do not think the necessary support. At the same time, this is where we need the universality. Actually, I want to answer one more question here. I remember about this age of marriage or child marriage. If we apply the universality principle of the Children's Right Convention, so age of majority is 18. So, I mean, we should not allow any country to marry off children. So we have to wait to the right age, 18. After 18, you are an adult, major. So the law, if we apply universality principles of law in every country, whether it's a Muslim country, Buddhist country, we don't care, then we can protect rights of people, especially young girls. So I'm also answering the first question. Actually, I forgot to answer. Another one, actually, I think since we did not focus on men, we really have to work with men in every country, because we always preach to the audience, we don't work with perpetrators. Not all men are perpetrators. I have seen masculinity also kill men and women. They use their violence, extremism against women or vulnerable people. So in whole universality principle, we have to work with men, work with women, young girls and boys to address this issue. I think I answered two other questions.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Shamila. Well, there's a question about disabled people or people living with different abilities. I don't know whether Sharon would like to answer that. How to strengthen our attention to gender equality or violence against women among disabled people. So would you like to answer that? Yeah, please.
Yeah. Okay. I think for the most part, the disabled and of course the LGBT community is almost invisible, still invisible in terms of the overall and gender equality movement. So we can strengthen their position, and you can make them more represented by being more proactive, by recognizing that they have um, unique um, needs and wishes, and also continuing on with the dialogue and continuously engaging them, so that we will also be apprised of their demands and wishes. I think that's the most part. We have to acknowledge, we each one of us should acknowledge that the human race is interconnected. That's the most important thing, and from there we can continue on and identify the next things to adopt, or the next move that we can uh, implement. No, but the most important thing I think is to acknowledge that they are still being underrepresented, and they have unique needs and wishes or demands, and from there we can go on and move forward.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, questions. Maybe this is from Mbak Yunianti Huzaifah. There's a question from Serli Rambu from East Nusa Tenggara. How can we build a local solidarity to global solidarity in terms of working with anti-gender-based violence movements across the world based on your own country situation?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
This is very important question that how to connect between local to national, regional, also in international context. I think CEDAW is a big home to adopt all those experience from many contexts. For instance, when we talk about honor killing, this is from certain experience from certain country, and when it legalized in the CEDAW, it also indirectly protecting women in other places. And also harmful practices. I think at the beginning, this is from experience from African countries, from local issues, and finally become like a global protection. I think this is important agenda. How we build solidarity and also global norm to protect women in other in many corners of the world. I remember when I joined CSW possibly 3 years or 4 years ago. At that time, in the draft of agreed conclusion, the word of supporting feminist movement almost wiped or erased by those diplomats who resistance to the feminist movement. But because of the solidarity from women's movement from across the world, finally those words, sentences, kept in the draft. So because it's very dangerous, is if they drop. And the agreed conclusion is also become a strategic policy for the donors and other. I can't imagine if those only 3-word sentence and will be erased will bring a serious impact to the women's movement. Another second point related to this issue is how to build the local issues. I think we have to reflect the feminist movement in many places, sometimes not really integrating intersectionality in the movements. For instance, the spirit of CEDAW is a global protection, but when it ratified to a certain country, it's become, territorialized to protect their citizens, but not human being across the world. So this is like a misunderstood. And I remember the important example of this, for instance, the issue of migration. From East Timor, for instance, a lot of death cases of migrant workers, especially women migrant workers working abroad. But the attention from feminist movement in those destination country not always giving serious attention to the migrant workers. I think this is a class bias. Over focus on their citizens, less solidarity. Even I have to acknowledge, for instance, in some of women's movement regionally, when they talk about migration, yes, they will bring the issues of migration, indigenous people, women, disability, etc. as a big flag for the common platform. But when they come back to the original country, I'm not sure whether they will pay attention on the issue of migration. This is, again, related to the challenge of how difficult to integrate about the intersectionality, especially related to the issue of class. The issue of marriage, I think a good example how women from Philippines traffic to Malaysia and also to finally, in the death row in Indonesia. And we speak out together. And this is a really good example how the global solidarity is very powerful to save the life of Mary Janes. And I think Mary Jane is one example, but a long list of women's migrants workers, in the death row that we have to campaign as big as Mary Jane, I think. Yeah, and this I think also touching about another question, Mas Dedi, about how to translate intersectionality in this complex, especially migration to Hong Kong. And again, for instance, what happening in Hong Kong, especially migrant workers, they face the issues of radicalism, terrorism, and why those women of migrant workers joining radicals or conservative group or even pro to the terrorist group, because this is like the gun of the weakers when they facing multiple layers of discrimination and neglected by the state, neglected by possibly another local women's movement, living in the isolated situation, and they found in the internet, by the promising of theological promises, and they will think they will easily grab that this will protecting them from those discrimination. So this is also dangerous. The impact of discrimination to the women, especially at the domestic space, domestic workers. I remember my finding from research in domestic workers in Saudi Arabia. At that time, they bring to the local healers to get the amulet, etc., because they think that I will not be protected in those destination countries. So this is the only, spiritual, psycho-spiritual and social, analysis, possibly to see the deeper aspect of radicalism and how to see the intersectionality that to see violence against women not enough by using political, cultural, and others, but we also have to integrating about the spiritual aspect behind this mind. This is my point, Ira.
Thank you so much, Mbak Yuni and Tim Zwaipa. Yeah, again, I'm really sorry I can't really read all of your questions in the chat, but I think most of the questions in the chat, like the speakers already answered. So the last one is Maria. So that's please 2 questions. So you are a feminist from Pakistan, and Pakistan is the second largest number of Muslim population, right, in the world, and you do not wear hijab or headscarf. How does your profile and identity represent or reflect the diversity of feminism in Pakistan or in Islamic context? That's the first one. And also, since you mentioned about post-colonialism, post-colonial feminist critique, so I would like to ask the question about well, Pakistan, we know that Pakistan has a unique history of colonialism that greatly inspires the growing development of post-colonial feminist critique in academia, right, and activism as well. So how does such academic criticism contribute to strengthening gender equality activism outside academia? So please, Maria.
Okay, so to your first question, I'm going to respond in 2 ways, right? Because and the response is different because this question can mean different things in different contexts. So my first response is to treat that question as very legitimate for it because it tells us something about intersectionality and privilege. So very much the fact that I personally come from a privileged background where I've had access to education, health, decision-making within my own home. And these are my rights, of course, but they are privileges in a context which I have access to because of my class and that so many women and men do not. So privilege is granted because I belong to a particular socioeconomic class. I am a Sunni Muslim, which is in Pakistan, we're a Sunni Muslim majority country. I'm from the province of Punjab, which also in many ways dominates bureaucracy, many other aspects of Pakistan. So and that is not to say that I'm not socialized into specific gender roles that I of course try and challenge and struggle with and have suffered as for having been a woman. So whether this is about my role as a mother, as a wife, my freedoms around sexuality, the presence or threat of very real violence in my life. So does my identity represent or reflect the diversity of women in Pakistan or specifically in an Islamic context? So yes and no. Yes, because I think this idea of one particular kind of Muslim subject is also problematic. But I would very much hesitate to suggest that I represent the diversity of the kinds of oppression that women face in my country. But I also feel like that doesn't stop me from forming alliances or connections or supporting and working with and for other groups of women in my country also. And so for me, diverse women working together across class boundaries, across ethnicity, race, or professional boundaries, and so on, has enormous appeal. And it is premised on the idea of shared power and not appropriation, of course. But I must always be very conscious of privilege and the fact that I do not represent different types of people in my country. And this idea of the hijab or of head covering is also, I think, become, it also comes from, and that brings me to the second sort of response to your question, which is this it reflects in some ways the perceptions or fears around Islam and women's rights and the quote unquote idea of women's empowerment within Muslim countries, which kind of demands one kind of subject, one that is oppressed and needs to be saved. And this kind of highlights the dangers. I mean, we've spoken about the need for cross-border solidarity or cross-region solidarity, but I think it also highlights the dangers and limitations of transnational feminism in that would try and save brown women, where it becomes much more problematic. And any solidarity has to really challenge these stereotypes as well as any models of empowerment that dictate what freedoms or autonomy, agency means in specific particular context. So feminism for me must always be anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, and very much anti-unregulated neoliberal development paradigms. So for example, wars we know have been fought to save women. Colonial projects, of course, were about civilizing natives, and we have neocolonialism. And this idea of pulling in women into development agendas where, she's exploited because she's a sound political and economic investment. For example, this idea of microcredit, which increases women's financial dependence on creditors and strengthens gendered inequalities and processes of capital accumulation, they've been exploited and justified in the name of women, right? So I think we need to look at this question and sort of delegitimize it almost when we talk about this Muslim subject and what she needs to look like. So that kind of is a response to your first question. The second one, I think, academic scholar, I think Undaria spoke to that right at the beginning of this session, is critical, and it must really fuel our activism. And I'm a firm believer in that, because I think it gives you perspective in terms of time and scale. And so it allows for historical analysis and also allows you to form solidarities across geographies and markers of identity, which kind of limit us and make us feel like, which reduce what women face to culture or religion. We have to look at more structured and systemic forms of oppression that are really connected across. And we have to be much more adaptive because capitalism has been adaptive, right? And patriarchies are adaptive as well. So I think scholarship allows that, academic work allows that, analysis allows that. And so we must really strengthen these ties between academia and activism in the streets. And in Pakistan's context, for example, I think we need much more, and I think globally also, we need much more feminist critique and analysis around militarization and securitization of nation states. Much more analysis around the political economy of violence, and around development paradigms and the women's question. So what constitutes agency, and what is voice and autonomy? And I think I think we very much need studies on which in the local context and also globally around the failure of liberal feminism, right? So I think we've had references to Kamala Harris and her, her ascension to corridors of power in the US, and this noise about breaking off the proverbial glass ceiling. But I think we need to sort of deepen that analysis much more, because I mean, liberal feminists basically asks us to be grateful that it is a woman and not a man who oppresses us, right? Who bans unions or orders bombs to be dropped, or press freedoms to be gagged in our context. So we need to have much more critical analysis on how articulations of feminism have failed us, so that we can build a feminism that mobilizes collectively around systems that creates the boss, or produces national borders, or manufactures the weapons that guard these borders. And so I think that that's something that we need to acknowledge and move from. And I think younger feminists in Pakistan have been much bolder and are able to make these links better. So we have a new generation of feminism in Pakistan, which really is able to talk about women's status and link it to the security state that prioritizes military expenditure above education and health, and talk about more systemic and structural forms of oppression. So yeah.
All right, thank you so much, Maria. Well, I think we run out of time, and unfortunately, we are at the end of our event today. So I will not conclude anything, but I hope we can meet at some point, like in some different meetings or forums. I think we just continue building our networks and global solidarity, local solidarity, whatever it is. It's about alliance, right? Alliance and solidarity. So thank you very much for all of the speakers, for the fruitful, inspiring and insightful stories, knowledge and experiences for all of you that you already shared with us. Thanks so much for all of the participants, joining here in this Zoom meeting, and also participants on the Facebook, because it's live streaming, and we also will be uploading this on our YouTube channel. Thank you for Mada and Yulia as our Indonesian Sign Language interpreters. We hope we can meet someday and continue our dialogue and discussion in other forums. And just one short announcement. Our next talk show is gonna be on December 12th, and it's about sexual and gender diversity from research and tolerance. So we will be inviting Sherin Graham Davis from Monash University. So she is the author of Challenging Gender Norms, 5 Gender Among Bugis in Indonesia. And also the book, her other book is about gender diversity in Indonesia, Sexuality, Islam, and Queer Selves. Dede Utomo from Gaya Nusantara, or Gay Archipelago, Julia Suryakusuma, columnist and author. So she's the author of the book Sex, Nation, and Power, and Wisnu Adihartono, a researcher. So finally, I want to say thank you so much for everyone. Keep up the good work and stay safe. Have a good one. Thank you so much. Bye.
You have a photo first?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
just take a photo. Okay.
Family photo.
Yeah, 1, 2, smile. 1, 2, 3, one more. Okay, the second screen. All right. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you.
And happy.
Thank you, Ira.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
makasih.
you.
Thank you, Mbak Aida.
Yeah,
Ayuni,
thank
Sharon,
you, Ira.
Shamila, dan
Thank you, Farid.
Yeah,
Thank
it's
you.
still open
Thank
if you
Thank
wanna
you.
keep the conversation.
Okay.
The Zoom is still open.
Thank you, Farid, and
Thank you so much,
Sharon.
Sandra.
Thank you very
See
much.
you.
Sharon, Mbak Aida, Mbak Yuni,
Yeah,
thank
Farid.
you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank
Terima
you, Mbak Aida.
kasih.
Makasih
Terima kasih, Mbak
banyak.
Yuni.
Terima kasih Mbak Yuni.
Okay,
Ya,
thank
Ira.
you.
Banyak. Selamat beraktivitas.
Sampai ketemu ya.
Jam 1 pagi di sini, hampir jam 1 pagi.
Oh my God, ya
Oh
Allah.
my God.
Iya,
Bye.
Noprita, thank
Ngantuk
you.
Sanira, agak ngantuk.
Jaya,
Iya, jam
Yes.
1 pagi.
Ya
Okay, take care.
ampun.
See
Iya.
you.
Oh my God.
Mbak Yuni,
Karena
Ya udah,
makasih banyak.
dadah.
makasih
Where is
Mbak.
Maria? Maria,
Yeah,
thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ya.
Soalnya the different time zones, Mbak. Jadi we have to sacrifice.
Oh ya
Okay,
ampun.
that's good.
Oke, ya.
Iya
Begadang.
bener ya.
It's okay.
Begadang. Iya, oke. Ya udah
Oke,
istirahat, Ira.
Oke, kita
Iya.
tutup. Makasih banyak ya
Dadah.
Mbak Yuni ya. Terima kasih Mbak
Bye.
Ida. Yuk, yuk.
Iya,
Assalamualaikum.
sampai ketemu dah.
Ya.
Salam buat Allegra ya.
Iya,
Yeah.
Mbak. Makasih.
Dadah.
I think Jaya is just here.
She left.
Our
ya.
friend from India. Jaya, how are you?
Oh, hai Jaya.
We still have some people here. Sorry, Jaya was late. Jaya
Oh, you
was,
late.
yeah.
Dr. Jaya is from India. You unmuted. You muted yourself. Oh, we still live in Facebook. You want to stop?
Is it?
Stop it.
Am I audible?
Yeah, it stopped already.